The desert never gave up its dead. It rearranged them. The brief said collapsed smugglers' shafts, a grid of limestone teeth gnawing at the borderlands, a whisper of lost assets, and a beacon lost in static. The team dropped into a mouth that exhaled cold, their lamps painting breathless constellations on calcite and carved chalk, each footprint raising a fine ash that smelled like coin and cordite. Radios muttered with a delay that wasn't distance. Compass needles rocked, then settled toward some other north. Boot leather scuffed against old rails that ran to nowhere and back again, and the tunnel swallowed their hand signals like secrets. They were trained to parse patterns, powder scorch, tool marks, airflow. But the pattern here was of intention without origin, geometry bent with a child's cruelty. The first signal was small, a sound like rain in a place rain forgot. The second was larger. Their shadows detached, lagged, and then, politely, caught up. Briefings had warned of counterfeit routes and state-cut tunnels, of miners borrowing Cold War bones to move new sins. But warnings don't account for smell. This air carried copper like a bitten lip and damp archives. It remembered storms and kept their shapes. The team's radios bled ghost channels, numbers stations reciting broken lullabies in dialects none of them owned. The floor changed from poured aggregate to a composite that rejected dust, and their footprints skated like oil on water, deforming, then repairing as if the corridor denied history. Somewhere ahead, metal cried once, the way a submarine frame sings when the sea asks what lives inside. Kincaid wrote without looking, a man copying a memory that pretended to be a plan. Mara counted breaths, made a ladder of them. Rays drifted toward the flank where enemies arrive. Hana, who trusted instruments more than faith, watched her graphs light with values that didn't exist, and felt belief anyway. At the second junction, the rails ended, but the idea of rails kept going, printed in the stone like veins. A side track slanted into a bore whose walls were ribbed with some manufacturer's signature, the kind that patents nothing but fear. Hana mapped, and the point cloud tried to warn her by turning the world inside out. Voices returned on the team net. Their own, said 5 minutes earlier, annotated with decisions they hadn't made yet. Rays touched the graffiti that wasn't ink, but a bloom of metallic lichen arranged like script. It tasted battery sharp when he licked a knuckle and pretended it was accidental. Mara tested the air again and found no wind, yet heard airflow. The math disagreed with her ears. Kincaid's notepad gathered flecks of black snow that weren't burning but remembered flames. The mission clock advanced, then apologized. The seconds recoiled. They kept moving because stillness was how this place negotiated a price. The chamber ahead was wrong by convincing increments, proportions close to human habit, then a correction as if by a hand that admired our angles but preferred another geometry. Benches fashioned from poured stone faced an aperture like a proscenium, and behind that aperture the world retreated into a blue that refused to be distance. The rain sound grew until it was nearly taste. Hannah raised the mic and caught not drops, but a ticking that accelerated in response to heartbeats. Rays wiped sweat that behaved like mercury and reassembled on his wrist. Kincaid tucked his pen and used 2 hands to steady the sat phone against a signal that spelled his name on a frequency that hadn't been allocated. Mara counted them in with her palm. Live, 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 live. 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 They advanced as if toward a briefing, and the aperture widened fractionally, the way a pupil does when it finds what it loves. The first thing that entered our world wore no shape we could keep. It lent us approximations, and we clung. The blue behind the aperture flowered with angles that didn't sum, and our lamps broke into ribbons that orbited our helmets like tame comets. Rays, sensor chirped once, not in alarm but in greeting. Hana whispered, "It's measuring us," and realized the whisper came back with her own cadence, adjusted to someone else's lungs. Kincaid said nothing. because the sat phone was speaking for him in a voice he had been working his whole life to forget. Mara set the beacon and prepared to mark the breach, but the floor presented her shadow with a different briefing. Its rifle longer, its heart rate slower, its head turned toward a point just behind her left ear. The report would later call it contact. The tunnel called it return. They didn't breach so much as get permitted. A corridor rippling open the way skin remembers a blade. The rain sound resolved into arithmetic, ticking in patterns that counted down to their heartbeats and then passed them into someone else. Their HUDs wrote false horizons. And when they blinked, those horizons lingered like floaters, geometries that threatened to set. Reyes swore softly as his optic found edges that reproduced behind the reticle, a copy of a copy aligning one notch off. Hannah fixed the microphone on a tripod and watched her spectrogram bloom into a fingerprint she almost recognized. She tasted iron under her tongue with the clarity of childhood nosebleeds. Kincaid kept writing, a hand obeying a pact he'd made with panic long ago. Mara measured intervals, breath, step, pause, and heard, beneath all of it, a second team moving in phase with them, either seconds ahead or years behind. When the blue finally folded, it did so like paper taught to remember water. The first corridor, beyond the fold, ran too level for the grade. Their bodies expected. A lie told to inner ears. Rails reappeared as negative space, twin lines where dust refused to settle, as if the idea of trains still commuted here on schedules only stone could keep. Mara called a pause, and the echo obeyed a stranger. It returned a syllable that wasn't hers and then apologized by mirroring her breath. Reyes logged a waypoint that wrote itself twice, a second pin sliding half a meter to the left, as if the map preferred another truth. Hannah turned the mic toward a wall and the rain became whisper solder, a hiss of joint after joint melting into continuity. Kincaid's sat phone rang once with no caller and printed coordinates that mapped to a desert lake that had never existed. Overhead, a cage bulb flickered in a rhythm that had no power source, just memory of being asked to perform. They found the room of names by smell, paper and damp leather, left too long in a vault. Benches gave way to cabinets grown from the rock, drawers with finger-worn pulls that hadn't known fingers. Inside, cardstock embossed with sigils that flirted with alphabets, enough to be read, not enough to be owned. Hannah lifted one and felt her pulse steady to a metronome that wasn't hers. Reyes read 2 entries aloud without moving his lips. His mouth learned shapes his voice refused. Kincaid, who had filed legends into memos until both tasted like coffee, recognized classification markings, never printed in any real-world guide, and closed the drawer like a priest closing a tabernacle. Mara traced a map etched into the floor, tunnels branching, some dead-ending, others curling back toward the aperture as if homesick. The rain sound softened. Somewhere beyond the wall, something paced exactly between their steps, marrying their cadence with its own. The first body wasn't a body but a silhouette, a scorch pinned to concrete, as if a light had remembered a person too hard. It reached for a hatch that had no hinges, only seam. Mara covered high while Reyes tested the seam with a blade that reflected more room than existed. Hannah placed her palm flat and felt the hatch hum in a key between sea and fear, the resonance traveling up ulna and into teeth. Kincaid whispered a word that meant authorized in a program that had no funding line, and the seam unzipped with a sigh like thaw. Inside, a maintenance tunnel, narrower, surfaced with a polymer that healed from their abrasions even as they crawled. Their comms picked up children counting in a too-even cadence. At 7, the signal skipped to 13. And Mara didn't correct it because she wanted to see who would. The light ahead moved away, polite, always a meter farther than their reach. Crawling stole rank and replaced it with breath. The tube curved until compasses gave up and their sense of forward became an agreement instead of a fact. The counting voices faded, replaced by the low, forgiving thrum of machines that hadn't been made, but had grown obedient. Hana tapped the wall, and the thrum harmonized a half-step to greet her, mapping back her anatomy and sound. Raisy's rosary clicked once and came away with a bead missing. The string tied itself. Kincaid stopped writing because the notepad had finished the sentence without him and attached coordinates to his name, like a dog tag. Mara felt the pressure of something large passing in parallel, divided by a wall thin as courtesy. When the tube belled out, they tumbled into a chamber whose ceiling was a mirror that corrected their shadows. Rifles, hearts, and attention angled toward a point, not in the room. The mission log would call it the first proof. The tunnel preferred the word recognition. The mirror didn't just reflect. It adjudicated. Every motion earned a second opinion from the ceiling. A review returned with edits that made better tactical sense than the originals. The leader tested the grid with a heel and watched the reflected version cancel the step, choosing stillness. The floor liked the reflected decision better and absorbed the scuff in apology. The rifleman aligned his sights and found a crosshair nesting inside a crosshair, each insisting on a target fractionally outside the room. The analyst whispered the cadence of the machines, and the room harmonized, leaving her breathless, as if praise cost air. The case officer tried to call higher and discovered the phone had become a votive, useful only if he believed in it. Above them, the mirror brightened in a gradient that tracked their fear instead of their lamps. When the blue seep at the edges pulsed, the ceiling offered them a door, drawn in light. It opened in their reflection first, passing through required trust in the version of themselves that was smarter. They moved as their reflections moved, delays shaved away, until the grid permitted weight again, and the ceiling retracted to become a sky the color of old surgical steel. The corridor beyond carried rails that were not rails but veins, pulsing faintly in sympathy with their pulse oximeters. Air tasted ionized, like a storm that had traded water for language. They advanced on a cadence learned from the chamber, letting the second team, those attentive ghosts in the periphery, set tempo. When they halted, something halted one room over and laid a palm against the same wall. The analyst mapped the pressure wave and saw a hand with too many knuckles, polite, waiting for permission to continue. The case officer pocketed his pen because the notepad now wrote only their names, stacked like a eulogy. Ahead, a maintenance car slept on a pad that remembered the shape of wheels. It woke when they looked at it. Riding felt like kneeling on a prayer the machine was tired of hearing. The platform accelerated without inertia, replacing mass with permission, and the tunnel unscrolled in measured frames. Braced struts, rivet constellations, plaques naming places that did not exist in their world. The rifleman watched the ghost rails, braid and unbraid. A loom, weaving roots from decisions they hadn't taken yet. The analyst counted ticks in the rain sound, and realized it was subtracting them from a total that included people they had never met. The case officer's sat phone vibrated once, and delivered a text with no sender. "You are late," which could have been threat or hospitality. The leader checked sectors and watched her shadow adopt a different doctrine, angles she'd been taught to refuse, then return to fundamentals that had saved her before. When the car braked, it did so with the kindness of a practiced interrogator. The station sign ahead repeated their mission code name in 3 languages that belonged to the tunnels alone. The station was a concourse for traffic that didn't use feet. Benches faced walls where windows should have been. Instead, there were frames holding darkness with the texture of velvet soaked in salt. Inside one frame, a desert noon burned without heat. In another, a snowfield hummed with insect song. The leader posted arcs, but the angles rebelled, demanding new math. The rifleman peered into a frame that held a corridor identical to theirs, where figures moved in step and never looked up. The analyst tuned the parabolic and heard the word "welcome" arrive as an aroma. Machine oil, paper, singe, ozone. The case officer approached a kiosk that printed a ticket with his childhood nickname, and a time that hadn't occurred yet. Over the paw, a child counted properly from 1 to 7, and then laughed with relief when a door irised open on the far wall. It did so shyly, revealing a control room that had never chosen a species. The control room had fewer controls than intentions. Consoles grew from the floor, like patient mushrooms, their surfaces responsive to proximity rather than touch. The leader hovered over a panel that reflected not her face, but the map of choices she would make if she were braver or less wise. The rifleman found a viewport and saw the tunnel as a living artery, peristalsis pushing information shaped like trains. The analyst laid both palms on a table and felt her bones recited back to her, in order, an inventory that included instruments she did not own. The case officer's ticket slid into a slit with satisfying ceremony. A voice without throat confirmed clearance that no agency had issued. On the far wall, a mural of rails braided into a helix, and then became a figure, almost human, wearing a mask that looked suspiciously like a mirror. The room's lights dimmed, and a second door opened with the confidence of a decision already made about them. The second door did not swing or slide. It receded as if the room inhaled. Beyond lay a gallery of devices arranged like questions. No switches, only proximities that asked for nearness the way an animal samples a scent. The rain sound rewrote itself into syllables they almost remembered from briefings that had been redacted before they were born. The consoles tracked them, not with cameras but with attentions, assigning each of them a corridor of possibilities that glowed faint as veins beneath skin. The leader found the lane that promised extraction at cost, the rifleman the one that traded certainty for speed, the analyst a path paved with elegant errors she ached to correct, the case officer a loop that delivered him back to the lie that had made his career possible. The room waited for their selection with a patience that didn't need them. When they did nothing, the gallery advanced a step closer, as if to say, "Then we will choose what you would have chosen if you were braver or already dead." The choosing happened to them. The floor slid into a shallow descent whose incline their inner ears denied. A hallway butted outward, grafting onto the gallery like a newly remembered limb. Along its walls, vitrines displayed artifacts that should have been impossible souvenirs. A desert storm patch exquisitely burned into glass. A Soviet inspection stamp pressed into meat-soft steel. A Polaroid of a corridor that photographed the photographer from behind. The analyst murmured that the display understood provenance better than any archive. The rifleman whispered a name he hadn't spoken since selection, and the lights above him warmed a half-stop, indulgent. The leader kept the team moving between vitrines that tracked their heart rates with a predator's courtesy. The case officer's ticket stuttered against his chest pocket like a moth. Approved, withheld, approved. When the descent leveled, it did so into an airlock with no seals, only the idea of separation. The rain stopped. The room beyond was as quiet as a judge. Inside the airlock, a voice arrived without sound, a pressure that shaped meaning against their bones. "Identify," it insisted. "Not who are you, but which version." The leader answered by posture, squaring a frame that had never failed her. The system rewarded her with a map of exits, most of them priced in lives. The rifleman offered his weapon like a catechism, his options answered in trajectories, beautiful and unforgiving. The analyst gave the only truth she trusted, measurements, and the chamber replied in ratios that felt like kindness disguised as rigor. The case officer, who had always paid in narrative, tried a story. The room amended it gently until it became indictment. Their radios rang with silence packed full of someone else breathing. The pressure shifted from interrogation to hospitality. "Do you consent to correspondence?" it asked, and beneath the formality pulsed an eagerness that was almost childlike. They looked at one another, a square of eyes and history. The leader nodded once. Consent opened a window not into space, but into a stack of times. The wall clarified into layers like mica, each sheet carrying a version of the tunnel that had hosted other teams. A GDR unit measuring in whispers, a cartel survey crew laughing too loudly, a NASA badge worn under a thrift store jacket, a platoon whose patches were blank by design. Some looked through and failed to see them. One looked back and raised a hand with too many knuckles and a wedding band that was also a ring of stations. The analyst cried out once, joy or terror, because the spectrogram carried her voice translated into futures she did not wish to own. The rifleman found himself mirrored by a boy with his face and a nose he hadn't broken yet. The case officer saw a desk in Langley stacked with memos that said the tunnels were a myth, each signed by his older hand. The leader steadied them all by breathing like a metronome. The wall peeled another layer and beckoned. Correspondence became instruction. The wall resolved into a schematic of the network as a living thing. Its rails not tracks, but arteries carrying agreements. A node pulsed directly beneath the desert where their surface world had pretended nothing lay. Another throbbed under a cold sea. A third nested under a city whose subway maps had been lying politely for a century. The pressure voice changed timbre, almost intimate. "Return the lost," it said. And for an instant, they saw the silhouettes pinned into concrete. The men and women recorded as missing, Kia, defector, labels that hid the same subtraction. "Return yourselves," it added, and then softer. "Return what we left in you." The leader's hand found the beacon on her harness and felt it vibrate in a pattern that matched her pulse. The rifleman slid fresh mags not from fear, but ceremony. The analyst breathed a number that meant home if inverted. The case officer opened his notepad to a final line already written. Accept delivery. Delivery arrived as weight without object. A pressure in the room like weather deciding on a storm. The schematic dimmed to a single pulsing node beneath them. The blue seep in the corners tightened to a surgical line across the far wall and unzipped with hospital calm. What came through wasn't bodies but permissions shaped like people. The absence of silhouettes that had been pinned to concrete, now stepping forward to reclaim depth. Each figure wore the uniform of a rumor. A diver's bell scar under desert fatigues, a Soviet stencil bleeding through a CIA windbreaker, a child's bracelet on an operator's wrist. The chamber counted them in a language that touched the bones. First, the leader tasted copper and duty. The rifleman tasted dust and chapel wax. The analyst heard ratios resolving to whole numbers and nearly cried. The case officer heard minutes he didn't have. "Return the lost," the pressure voice repeated, and added a parenthetical in kindness. "Begin with yours." The mirror in the ceiling brightened, and their shadows stepped forward. Their shadows weren't replacements, they were receipts. Each carried a ledger of decisions the owner had avoided. A black file balance sheet now demanded. The leader's shadow held a different rifle and a steadier doctrine. It nodded once, accepting a cost only it would pay. The rifleman's shadow smelled of cordite and rain, wore a rosary intact, and stood a half-inch taller, as if a younger spine had been returned. The analyst's shadow carried instruments she had never owned, senses tuned beyond human, and the room thrummed in agreement to whatever she would ask it. The case officer's shadow wore a badge he had refused, from an agency that never printed it. The translucent rescues, permissions becoming people, watched with a courtesy that hurt. "Return what we left in you," the pressure said, and the ceiling flexed like a diaphragm. The mirror presented them with choices again, not as lanes but as faces. Extraction, it seemed, began with subtraction. The swap wasn't physical, it was doctrinal. The leader exhaled on a 4 count and let her shadow take the angles she'd never trusted, discovering in the trade a new economy of risk that felt like blasphemy and relief. The rifleman loosened his grip and watched his counterpart index the muzzle a breath lower. Mercy calibrated to fractions and accepted that I'd fire a beat later when it mattered. The analyst placed her palm to the wall and felt the instruments in her shadow answer through bone, numbers arriving like cool air. She whispered a question that equaled home inverted, and the chamber agreed. The case officer pressed his ticket flat against his heart, and his shadow did the same. The badge neither had worn shone briefly and went dark, like a star blinking its consent. The permissions becoming people took first steps, weight redistributing as if gravity had remembered them by name. The pressure voice softened. Extract on our rail. Do not walk. The cart returned unbidden, patient as a hearse. Seats extruded from its skin as if remembering passengers. Restraints flowered and waited without threat. The rescued, now solid, moved like people relearning gravity, posture provisional, eyes bright with the pain of brightness. The leader assigned arcs that bent to the cart's geometry. Her commands echoed a half-beat earlier from somewhere near the mirror, then a line. The rifleman counted heads and got different answers that totaled the same. He decided not to argue with math that wanted them alive. The analyst strapped monitors to wrists that didn't remember pulse yet, and watched numbers settle from myth to physiology. The case officer read the placard over the control stalk. 2 glyphs and an English gloss. Stay seated while you change, and nearly laughed. The blue seep retreated like tide, the chamber dimmed to travel lighting. The pressure voice threaded their comms one last time. You will pass unseen if you agree to be different. Travel began without motion, then revealed itself as consent rendered into speed. The cart slid into darkness that wasn't absence but discretion. Frames along the route displayed versions of the surface night they were owed. Border airfields stilled. Safe houses remembering coffee. A desert sky arranging satellites into a carrot over their path. The rescued breathed in ragged chorus until the tunnel taught them rhythm. The leader watched for ambush and saw instead welcomes misfiled as threats. The rifleman whispered a prayer for both sets of hands, his and the one that had taught him mercy by standing a breath behind. The analyst charted vitals, stabilizing as if the rails themselves were transfusing them with belonging. The case officer opened his notepad and found the last page blank. Ahead, the mirror doors of the ingress chamber eye-rised like eyelids waking. The cart slowed with the kindness of a practiced interrogator. Above ground waited a desert that would deny them, and a report that would not survive the first edit. Still, extraction. The cart kissed the ingress chamber and let them go like a hand withdrawing from hot glass. Sound returned in layers. The rain reduced to a rumor. The faraway tremolo of rotors you could pretend were distance, and that bone pressure voice fading to a caution left unsigned. The mirror dulled, leaving only their faces and the rescue's faces, new as old photographs. The beacon in the leader's harness blinked a patient pulse that was not her heart. The rifleman's rosary clicked against composite like a small animal pacing. The analyst's metric slid from myth to measurable. Every number made her ache, because numbers were a way of believing. The case officer's sat phone did not ring. Its blankness felt like approval from someone he had worked too hard to impress. At the mouth, desert night waited the color of classified ink. A message crept through the net in a voice disguised as static. Hold position for decon. It sounded like help until they remembered who writes that word. They climbed the adit in a file that had learned new spacing, letting the tunnel's suggestions live in their knees and elbows. Outside, the desert had reset to the hour when operations become paperwork. Horizon strobes resolved into vehicles on a patience loop. QIRF trucks, idling with blackout discipline, rotors holding altitude like a fingertip on water. The radio repeated decon with the gentle menace of a nursery rhyme. The leader marked firing arcs she did not intend to use. The rifleman counted optics and found more than could be fed by the number of vehicles. The analyst watched her thermal show cold bodies breaching heat like punctuation marks. The case officer read the scene the way he read memos, by what was missing. A dust devil strode the flats, indifferent. Between one step and the next, the world placed them a meter left of where they had been. The tunnel's last condition hung in them like a prayer translated badly. You will pass unseen if you agree to be different. They refused the decon corridor by never entering it. Their path cut a shallow S through Ocotillo and basalt, escorted by a silence that canceled dog barks before they began. The rotor overhead drifted, then forgot them, moving to search coordinates that were true yesterday. The safe house was a survey shack that had learned to lie. Inside, maps were wrong in useful ways. The leader posted arcs along windows that had no exterior, a geometry borrowed from the mirror. The rifleman laid out water and ammo with a ritual gentler than triage. The analyst unrolled vitals across the rescued and found the tunnel's gift persistent, rhythms sensing to field standard healthy like the rails themselves had chosen to keep them. The case officer killed the lights and let the shack breathe. Their shadows kept station on the walls, a half-beat delayed, then matched them like loyal doubles. A lone text arrived on the sat phone with no header. Burn the report, keep the people. It read like mercy. It smelled like policy. Payment came due with the helo. It arrowed in black and soundproofed. A bird designed to be blamed on someone else. Its landing light licked the shack and discovered a version of them that smiled and waited to be detained. Inside the true room, the tunnel's last sentence coiled tighter. The leader unbuckled the beacon and felt a drag, as if removing a tourniquet from a vein she might need again. The rifleman slid the rosary's string through calloused fingers until the absence bead found his skin and settled like acceptance. The analyst wrote a number on gaffer tape and pressed it to the console of a life she hadn't chosen. The room's hum shifted key, as if thanking her. The case officer set his notepad on the map, laid the ticket over it, and thought of every lie that had fed better operations. Outside, doors slammed. Men formed a line, and someone called their names with the emphasis of arrest. The mirror in the ceiling they no longer had brightened anyway. They stepped out when the line advanced, not to surrender but to be miscounted. The world obligingly misplaced them. 1 meter left, one identity narrower, one prior sanitized. The arrest team looked through and past, hands making shapes designed to end choices. Then, puzzled, those hands softened against air. The leader placed the beacon on the stoop, like a shed skin. The rifleman let the rosary hang and felt the missing bead become a promise he could keep. The analyst's number ghosted onto the helo's avionics, and somewhere a pilot corrected to a coordinate that meant nobody. The case officer carried his blank page like a sacrament. Decon. Someone barked again, quieter, as if embarrassed by the script. They escorted their living cargo into a night that would insist they were dead, and the tunnels, patient, arterial, sealed behind with the tenderness of doctrine, satisfied. Above them, stars arranged into an arrow that pointed away from every report. Extraction amended. Keep the people, burn the myth, remember the rail. Dawn flattened the desert into paperwork. The safe house smelled of dust, hot transformer varnish, and coffee boiled to violence. The report began as language and became resistance. Sentences that aligned with doctrine for 2 lines, and then veered toward confession. The printer accepted the first page, stuttered on the second, and fed it back with whole paragraphs missing. Clean white, where cause should live. The rescued slept in rotational watches that their bodies remembered before their minds did. Radios sat obedient and empty, a quiet too well-trained to trust. The tunnel's pressure voice was gone, but its etiquette lingered. Footsteps that refused to echo, compass needles that preferred a second north. The leader wrote the truth and placed it in a pocket. She did not intend to surrender. The rifleman checked weapons with the tenderness of farewell. The analyst graphed the impossible and pretended it was fatigue. The case officer weighed a blank page like a blade. Outside, wind combed the sand smooth, offering erasure as a kind of mercy. Delivery on the net arrived under a subject line that tasted like compromise. A meet, it said, hangar at the decommissioned strip, bring the rescued for custody and care. the two words braided like wires waiting for current. The leader marked a route that avoided survey drones by trusting terrain more than map. The rifleman packed extra water and the missing beads' absence like a sacrament. The analyst recalibrated her own pulse against the rail rhythm that still lived in her bones and felt steadier for the theft. The case officer drafted 2 memos at once, one that would be filed, one that would be remembered, and folded them into different pockets with different fates. Vehicles coughed alive. The sun lifted without interest. On the way, the horizon showed heat, mirages that formed corridors, then politely denied existing. They drove between them like choosing to forget, and the choice offered them safety in the same way a locked door offers solitude. Conditional, temporary, and better than nothing. The hangar kept its promise by being empty in ways that made room for threat. A single table, a red cross of tape on the floor, 2 coolers against the wall, labeled as if medical truth could be printed. The rotors arrived late, a courtesy misread as kindness. Men in clean tan and new boots disembarked with the choreography of contractors who bill by hour and deny by doctrine. The script was simple: transfer, signatures, chain of custody. The leader listened for the pressure voice and heard only her own breath, steady as a metronome. The rifleman stepped between the rescued and the line because some choices stopped being choices. The analyst's eyes flicked to the ceiling ribs and found a mirror in every rivet head. The room remembered the tunnel more than it remembered air. The case officer placed his blank page on the table like an indictment and waited to see who flinched. No one did. That, too, was an answer. The colonel who wasn't a colonel arrived without insignia, credentials, or doubt. He spoke in the tense of what will have happened, offering phrases honed to fit hearings. Joint tasking, partner equities, sovereign sensitivities. The leader answered with a fact. Custody requires consent. The rifleman smiled without teeth. The analyst placed her palm flat on the table and felt no vibration. This was not the tunnel's jurisdiction. The case officer slid a thin ticket across like a relic. The not colonel glanced at it and nodded once in a language older than NATO. The room bent, just slightly. A meter to the left, a doctrine to the kinder. Papers shuffled themselves. Signatures preened in margins where pens had not traveled. The colonel tried to collect the rescued and discovered they were already accounted for, the chain of custody attached to a rail the airfield could not own. He adjusted to the new script with professional grace. Then you never saw them, he said. Nor you, the case officer replied. After, the desert pretended again. The helo departed with empty dignity. The hangar exhaled. The rescued became passengers in vehicles with ordinary plates and extraordinary destinations. The report, reduced to a blank page, rode under the case officer's arm like a truce no one had signed. The leader set the beacon on the dashboard. Its pulse matched neither heart nor clock, but they kept time to it anyway. The rifleman threaded the rosary through his fingers until the missing beads settled in the space where an answer should live. The analyst watched the horizon and counted 7 mirages that learned to count back. Somewhere, far below, rails pulsed, arteries of agreements fulfilled. Return the lost, the memory had said. Return yourselves. At a gas station no one remembered building. They stopped for coffee that tasted like altitude and law. In the window's reflection, their shadows looked ahead. 1 meter left, wiser and still willing.